Something was very wrong in the home on the quiet street in Seekonk, Massachusetts, and by the time a Catholic priest called Ed and Lorraine Warren for help in the 1970s, the family living there had reached the edge of their endurance. This working-class household with several children had lived peacefully in their home for 3 years before the nightmare began, and what started as sounds they tried to dismiss as an old house settling had transformed into something no rational mind could explain away. The priest who made the call to the New England Society for Psychic Research had himself witnessed objects move during his visit to pray over the family, an experience that shook him so deeply he knew this situation required more than prayer alone. Ed and Lorraine Warren, already established as the preeminent paranormal investigators in the region, understood that when clergy reached out for assistance, the situation had typically progressed beyond anything ordinary intervention could address. Seekonk occupies a stretch of the Blackstone River Valley along the Rhode Island border, land shaped by centuries of colonial settlement and industrial mill work, where generations had lived and died and left their marks both visible and invisible on the landscape. The Warren case files would eventually classify what happened in that house as a demonic infestation, a term that carried specific meaning within their investigative framework and indicated an adversarial intelligence that had claimed territory and intended to stay. But before the Warrens arrived, before the priest made his call, the family endured months of escalating terror that followed a pattern Ed Warren had seen dozens of times before, what he called a graduated escalation that began at the edge of what people could rationalize and then pushed steadily past that threshold into undeniable supernatural activity. The early months brought sounds that the family tried desperately to explain away as anything but what they feared they might be. Footsteps climbed the stairs when everyone was accounted for in other rooms. Knocking echoed from inside the walls with no plumbing or structural cause. Most disturbing was the sound of a child crying in parts of the house where no child was present, a sound that would wake the parents in the deep hours of night and send them searching through rooms, finding nothing. These auditory phenomena gave way to visual experiences that were harder to dismiss. Shadows moved across walls in rooms where no light source could account for their passage. A figure appeared at the end of hallways, solid enough to be mistaken for a family member until someone called out and it dissolved like smoke. The family tried to maintain normalcy, tried to convince themselves and each other that there were explanations they simply had not yet discovered, but that fragile denial shattered when the physical phenomena began. Furniture started appearing in different locations each morning, despite the family securing it carefully the night before. Their dog, which had always moved freely through the house, began refusing to enter certain rooms and would stand in doorways whimpering and trembling. Most alarming were the objects that launched themselves from shelves with a force that appeared deliberate rather than accidental, flying across rooms as if thrown by invisible hands. The children bore the worst of it, reporting nightly disturbances that left them exhausted and anxious, their sleep disrupted by presences they could feel but not see, by the certainty that something was in their rooms watching them in the darkness. The parents watched helplessly as their children deteriorated, as the home that should have been their sanctuary became a source of dread, and they understood they were running out of time before something worse happened. When Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived with their NESBR investigative team, they brought decades of experience and a methodological approach that treated each case with scientific rigor while remaining open to spiritual realities that conventional science refused to acknowledge. Lorraine walked through the property in a state of heightened psychic sensitivity, her natural clairvoyant abilities allowing her to perceive things most people could not see or feel. She paused for long minutes in the kitchen and at the base of the main staircase, her face troubled, before moving to the upper floor where the children slept. At the interior wall that the family dog refused to approach, the same wall against which thrown objects had originated, Lorraine encountered what she described as a cold and agitated energy, something that radiated malice and territoriality. She could feel it watching her, assessing her, and the sensation made her skin crawl in a way that few hauntings ever did despite her years of experience. Ed Warren approached the investigation from the historical angle, understanding that paranormal infestation rarely began without historical cause embedded in the land or structure itself. He spoke with neighbors, consulted local records, and traced the property's history back through previous owners and previous structures. What he discovered troubled him deeply. The land on which the current house stood had a complicated past that predated the existing structure by generations. A previous dwelling on the site had been associated with at least one documented tragedy, the kind of suffering and violence that could leave a spiritual stain lasting decades or even centuries. This historical grounding fit Warren's understanding that inhuman intelligence required conditions to establish itself, that it fed on suffering and trauma the way plants feed on soil nutrients, drawing strength from the accumulated sorrows of a place. The picture that emerged from the Warren investigation was of a moderate but genuine demonic infestation, not the full-scale oppression they had encountered in cases like the Perrin farmhouse that would later become famous as the Conjuring case, but a purposeful adversarial intelligence that had established territory and was systematically working to destabilize the family. During a carefully supervised period of light trance, Lorraine received impressions that disturbed her profoundly. She sensed ancient malice that predated not just the house, but the colonial settlement of the land itself, something that had been waiting and watching through centuries, regarding the family with what she could only describe as predatory patience. In Ed Warren's theological framework, entities of this class did not simply occupy locations, but actively degraded the spiritual and emotional resilience of their victims, creating conditions of fear, division, and despair that made people more susceptible to deeper levels of influence and ultimately possession. The children's deteriorating sleep was not incidental, Ed explained to the parents. The escalating anxiety, the sense of being watched, the nightmares, and the exhaustion were all deliberate results of the entity's strategy. It was weakening them, isolating them, preparing them. This explanation terrified the parents, but also galvanized them, because it meant there was an opponent to fight rather than just random supernatural chaos, and where there was an opponent, there could be victory. Ed and Lorraine coordinated a formal exorcism with the referring priest, who returned to the house to lead the clergy component of the intervention, while the Warrens managed investigation and spiritual support. The exorcism would proceed over several hours in 2 stages, beginning with blessing and cleansing of common areas, before concentrating on the interior wall and upper bedrooms where phenomena had been most severe. On the day of the exorcism, the house seemed to know what was coming. The atmosphere felt compressed, hostile, waiting. Lorraine remained in constant prayer throughout the procedure, maintaining what she described as a sustained spiritual barrier between the entity and everyone present. Ed documented each phase with his characteristic precision, recording temperature fluctuations and environmental changes. The family's animals had been removed temporarily, a standard precaution in cases where demonic presence had been confirmed. The priest began the ritual with ancient words of authority, consecrated water, and the full weight of his ordained office behind every syllable. For much of the procedure, the house remained still, almost mockingly quiet, but as the priest moved into the climactic phase, focused on the wall and the children's bedrooms, resistance manifested with shocking force. For approximately 20 minutes, the priest described feeling an oppressive force pushing against the words of the rite, a tangible presence that seemed to be contesting every prayer, every invocation, every command to depart. The temperature in the upper hallway dropped precipitously. Lorraine felt the entity's rage and desperation as it fought to maintain its territory, and she intensified her prayers, pouring everything she had into the spiritual barrier protecting the team. Ed watched his wife's face, saw the strain there, and added his own prayers to hers, decades of faith and experience focused into this single sustained effort. Then, abruptly, the resistance dissolved. Both investigators and the priest reported the same sudden shift, a lightening, an opening, a return of qualities that a home should naturally possess, but that had been absent for so long, the family had almost forgotten what normal felt like. The exorcism was complete. The entity that had claimed territory in the Seekonk house had been expelled by the combined authority of clergy and the supporting presence of experienced investigators who understood the spiritual battlefield on which such conflicts were fought. The family, who had been prepared to abandon their home just weeks earlier, chose to remain. In the days and weeks that followed, they reported that the phenomena ceased entirely. The children began sleeping through the night. The dog moved freely through all rooms again. The house felt like a home rather than a haunted prison. The Seekonk case was documented in NESBR files as a successfully resolved demonic infestation and became one of several Massachusetts cases that Ed Warren cited in his university lectures as evidence that paranormal activity occurred with regularity in ordinary family homes throughout New England, not just in famous locations that made headlines. The case reinforced the Warrens' long-standing conviction that clergy involvement was essential in resolving genuine demonic infestation. That paranormal investigation alone, without the spiritual authority carried by ordained clergy, was insufficient when an adversarial intelligence had established meaningful territory. This collaboration between investigative methodology and religious authority represented the core of the Warrens' approach across decades of service to afflicted families. The Seekonk haunting never achieved public prominence, never became the subject of books or films, but it represented precisely the kind of work that defined Ed and Lorraine Warren's calling. They had answered a family's desperate need, identified and expelled a genuine supernatural threat, and restored peace to a home where children could sleep safely again. The case files preserved in the NESBR archives stand as testament to one family's nightmare and their deliverance through the dedicated efforts of investigators who believed that the supernatural was real, that evil intelligences did invade ordinary homes, and that with faith, knowledge, and courage, such entities could be confronted and defeated, sending them back to whatever darkness had spawned them and leaving behind only silence, safety, and the profound relief of a battle won. Hashtags Vanishing Roads Ed and Lorraine Warren's Seekonk haunting paranormal investigation, demonic infestation, Warren case files, true paranormal haunted Massachusetts supernatural stories, ghost stories, demon hunters, real exorcism, paranormal documentary, creepy tales, horror stories. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.